Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and the Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and advocate for the eco-socialist program that we ran on in 2020. And today we have a guest, Arthur Pye, who's been an eyewitness to perhaps the most significant ongoing social revolution in the world today. And this is the Kurdish-led movement in Rojava or Rojava or Northeast Syria. And it's for a grassroots democratic, feminist, multi-ethnic, religiously tolerant, ecological, and socialist-oriented transformation of their society. And the guiding philosophy of the movement is been provided by a 25 years in prison leader of the Kurdish liberation movement, Abdullah Öcalan. And Öcalan derived much of his philosophy from Murray Bookchin, an American libertarian socialist who's influenced the American Green Movement. But in Rojava, they built real power. And so far, they've had a successful armed defense against attacks by ISIS, Turkey, the Assad regime, and Islamist militias like HTS, which is now in control of Damascus. So the Rojava Revolution is certainly the most powerful progressive movement in the Middle East, and it could provide a model for how diverse peoples in the Middle East can live together in peace, equality, and a sustainable society. So Arthur is a writer and a community organizer based in the Pacific Northwest. He recently returned from a year living in Northeast Syria, and he was studying the Rojava Revolution. He's a steering committee member of the Emergency Committee for Rojava, and his writing can be found at Strange Matters magazine, and we'll put some links into his articles and to the Emergency Committee for Rojava. So welcome, Arthur. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So why don't you start by giving people an overview of the history and aspirations of the Rojava Revolution?
Absolutely. I'll try to condense it as much as possible. It's a long, complicated history. There's lots of acronyms, kind of alphabet soup, and we'll try to keep those to a minimum. But really, the history of the Rojava Revolution can't be understood without understanding kind of the historical trajectory of the Kurdish freedom movement as a whole. And for the sake of understanding that, I think we'll go back to the founding of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, as its Kurdish acronym, in Turkey, or as Kurds would say, Bakur, North Kurdistan. And this is a party that was founded in the 1970s. It really came out of the sort of wave of left radicalism and anti-imperialism that was very much inspired by, national liberation movements in places like Cuba and Vietnam. And when the PKK was founded, its sort of political line was that the sort of politics of the Turkish left at that time left out this crucial question of Kurdish self-determination. And what they kind of brought to the struggle was the idea that Kurds as a people in Turkey and elsewhere were oppressed as a colonized people, and therefore needed to pursue a national liberation struggle for an independent socialist Kurdish state. So this was very much like a classic Marxist-Leninist national liberation movement in the spirit of that era. Just to go a little bit further back, for those who are unfamiliar, like, who are the Kurdish people? What's the Kurd? The Kurdish people are an indigenous people to the Middle East. There's 30-40 million Kurds in the world today. And the historic homelands that Kurdish people have inhabited were, after the end of World War I, they were broken up and intersected with nation state boundaries, right? So at the end of the First World War, and with the fall of the Ottoman Empire, kind of European powers came in and carved up the Middle East and drew kind of arbitrary lines in the sand. This European country was going to control this piece. This European country was going to control the other, right? So what is now Iraq was ended up under British jurisdiction, what's now Syria was under French jurisdiction, etc. And in Turkey, a Turkish republic was founded under extremely nationalist terms, which was for ethnically, culturally Turkic people, explicitly rejecting even the existence of Kurdish people. So you can imagine when something like this happens, minority populations are sort of systematically sidelined and marginalized. And the founding of the PKK is really like a culmination of this kind of building consciousness and resistance of the Kurdish people to colonization. So fast forwarding, the PKK ended up launching what they call an armed struggle against the Turkish state, culminating in years of heavy repression from the Turkish military against Kurdish communities, Kurdish villages. But the movement really ended up kind of spreading and inspiring Kurds outside the boundaries of the Turkish nation state, Kurds in northern Iraq, in Syria, in northwest Iran. And a big turning point happened in the history of this movement around the turn of the next century, right? So in 1999, the founding leader of the PKK, who Howie mentioned, Abdullah Öcalan, is captured. He was hiding in Syria. He fled the country after fear of being turned over to Turkish intelligence, and in a plot that was supported by the CIA and the Mossad, right, Israeli intelligence, and a kind of a whole international, what the movement calls like a conspiracy, was sort of tricked into being captured. Interestingly enough, he's actually on his way to South Africa, where Nelson Mandela was offering him support. And what happened after Öcalan was captured was he underwent this kind of profound period of reflection and self-criticism, personally and on behalf of the movement, a deep period of study. This is when he discovered and read the works of Murray Bookchin, right, the kind of green libertarian socialist philosopher based in Vermont. And things like reflecting on the historic experience and failings of sort of Soviet era, what they call real socialism, quote unquote, reflecting on the historic role of women in the movement, reflecting on kind of strengths and weaknesses that they'd practiced, lessons learned. He underwent this real transformation, and as a result, the movement itself went under an ideological transformation. And what that meant for them is that they moved towards this kind of libertarian socialism. In other words, rather than seeing the creation of new nation states or the seizure of power in a nation state as a sort of solution or vehicle to creating a free, liberated socialist society, they kind of turned this idea on its head. And they came to the conclusion that nation states themselves, state power itself, is a sort of institutional obstacle to real democracy, to true socialism, to the real kind of self-determination of all the region's diverse peoples. And therefore, their kind of new political program, which Öcalan coined as democratic confederalism, sought to liberate the Kurdish homeland not by creating a new nation state, drawing new borders, centralizing power, but rather by kind of democratizing Kurdish communities from the bottom up, block by block, village by village, through kind of grassroots self-organization of civil society. So fast forwarding yet again to the Syrian civil war, what happens in Rojava, which is just the Kurdish name for this part of Kurdistan that lies within Syria, is that a civil war breaks out around 2010, 2011. And in the kind of chaotic violence of those early days of the Syrian civil war, there's a power vacuum that emerges. Kurds are living in the north and the east of Syria. Historically, it's an undeveloped part of Syria. This wasn't a coincidence. And when Assad's power, right, the Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, when he's threatened with the overthrow by the armed opposition elsewhere in Syria, he withdraws most of his troops from the Kurdish regions, which are kind of outside of his reach and ability to kind of control. And in that vacuum, the movement went to work implementing these sort of renewed ideas of democratic confederalism. So when we talk about the Rojava Revolution, it's the societal project that's been built, developed, defended, really since that moment, so over the last 13, 14 years at this point, in Northeast Syria. So at this point, about a third of Syrian territory and 4 or 5 million people are living in an area administered what's officially known as the Democratic Autonomous Administration of Northeast Syria, which is kind of the official name of Rojava. And this is an area where instead of being administered under centralized state control, governance itself is kind of organized like a bit of an upside down pyramid. So the basic source of power, initiative, decision making comes all the way down, at least in principle and in many places in practice, to the neighborhood level, to the village level, to kind of human scale communities getting together face to face, identifying problems, discussing solutions, coordinating ways to address them. And those people form committees over various topics like economics, defense, health, women, education, all the basic aspects of making a society function. And they send elected delegates out to the city level, sort of wider, what we would think of here as like the county level, all the way up to kind of regional or their equivalent of like a national autonomous administration. And so the last thing to mention about this, before I'm sure there'll be lots of questions and we'll go all kinds of places with the conversation, is that in this kind of renewed philosophy of the Kurdish freedom movement, women's freedom is held as a central pillar, if not the central pillar of the whole movement. In the writings of Öcalan, you'll read things like women are the first colony, women are the first slave of humanity. And so they've really drawn a contrast with historic left movements that too often have kind of seen feminism, women's liberation as a sort of auxiliary issue. In other words, that after a socialist state is created or after the means of production are seized by workers, someday, then when we get rid of all these, like, these real problems like class, then we'll deal with things like gender and race, right? For the movement, they say no. They said the whole purpose of socialism for us, the whole purpose of this liberation movement is to build a free life. And the liberation of women is central to that there can be no socialism without the liberation of women. And so women have organized themselves autonomously at every level of society, not only in the way that governance is structured. So anytime there's elected leadership or delegates of these councils or communes or administrations, there have to be 2 elected leaders or delegates. They call it hevserok. It's like co-chairs. And one of them has to be a woman. There's women's organizations kind of in parallel to all the different institutions, which have institutionalized veto power over any kind of decisions that directly affect women. And then this extends even to the defense of society. So many people who are vaguely familiar, at least, with the Rojava Revolution or the kind of the story of the Kurdish people fighting against ISIS in Syria, are familiar that there are all women's militias. It's actually like basically a violation of the law for a woman fighter to be under the command of a man, period. So the YPJ is the Kurdish acronym, sorry, I told you alphabet soup, for the Women's Protection Units, which is this all-female self-defense force. So there's so much else that we could get into about the way that society's organized, or the guiding philosophy, or what's been happening on the ground in this very complicated war between them and ISIS and Turkey, and now this new government in Syria bringing new questions. So maybe I'll stop here and we can just see what questions you or other people have.
Well, why don't you say a few words about, some of your experiences when you were living there? I mean, what did you see? Give people sort of a human level view of what's going on.
Gladly. I was in Rojava for about a year. And I spent that time really traveling around, working, volunteering as a journalist primarily, and really conducting interviews, trying to understand not just how society was being structured, but how people lived and how everyday people saw this revolution and their role in it. And I really traveled around not just to different communities across northeast Syria, but also was lucky enough to spend time in sort of the diverse structures of the movement and of society. So I got to visit economic cooperatives and neighborhood communes and village councils. I got to visit women's organizations. I spent a bit of time visiting the front lines where the Turkish state and its sort of Islamist proxy militias were actively attacking not just Kurdish communities, because, by the way, it's really important to understand this is not just a region of Kurdish people. In fact, a majority of the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is the sort of umbrella of the different military, like self-defense groups, a majority of individual fighters are now Arab, right? I was talking about a third of Syrian territory, as you can imagine. I mean, Syria is an Arab majority country. This includes many, many Arab majority communities, but also other ethnic minorities, right? So like, and religious minorities, Yazidi people, Assyrian people, right? Syriacs, Armenians, all these different people. This revolution is trying to not just accept but embrace the sort of diversity of the region, encourage self-organization of all groups. So I was just really lucky to be able to travel around and to meet people, everyday people in the neighborhoods and villages, but also dedicated revolutionaries, people in positions of leadership, people working in civil society, people working in military structures. And it was just incredibly inspiring to witness people, frankly, taking their communities into their own hands. I think that was the most profound takeaway. I mean, some of my most inspiring moments that really stick with me to this day were not sort of like more exciting or scary moments where, there were Turkish drone strikes happening, or traveling to the front line, but really things like attending the commune meetings where neighbors were just getting together. They're reporting back on their different sort of like working groups. They're complaining. They're sometimes arguing with each other. And they're stumbling through the very real, very messy work of self-governance. And to see that what gave me chills. I mean, still to think about it this day, it's something I carry with me because it really, to me, was something I can't unsee, was proof in person with my own eyes that communities can govern themselves, that people can cooperate with one another. And if you can build a movement that has a vision that can unite people around these ideas of cooperation, of pluralism, of democratic self-governance, then it is possible. So I don't know if you have particular questions about, distinct experiences that I had, but I'm just trying to give you a bit of a rough overview there. People are more interested in anecdotes. You can also check out some articles that I've written for Strange Matters.
Before we get to people in the chat, let's talk about the current situation.
Yeah.
Turkey's been escalating its attacks.
Yeah.
You got a new government in Damascus, and Öcalan recently called for the PKK to disarm and disband and get into regular politics, including elections. So,
Yeah.
what's going on now?
So much. Like everything else tied to this topic, it's like it's more than you can ever get to in a defined period of time. It's true, there are major changes, kind of historic inflection points taking place right now, not just in Syria and in Rojava, but elsewhere in Kurdistan, as you mentioned, in the PKK's relationship to the Turkish state. Right, so like the PKK ended up inspiring broader, like the creation of sort of sister parties and organizations inspired by its ideas elsewhere, not just in Southeast Turkey or North Kurdistan, but in northern Iraq, northern Iran, and northern Syria. And so really these processes, things like, okay, we hear that there's a ceasefire that the PKK declared and Öcalan made this statement. And then over here across the border, there's things happening between the new government of Syria and the Syrian Democratic Forces. Really, they're all kind of tied to a similar process. They're just taking place in different local conditions. But in Syria, to start with, going back last year to kind of late November, early December, this group HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is sort of a rebranding of Jabhat al-Nusra, which was a faction of Al-Qaeda, they launched an offensive against the Syrian government, moving in from the areas of Idlib, west and north of Aleppo. And quickly, to the surprise of most of us, the Syrian military just collapsed. There was this kind of lightning offensive, and HTS continued to take more towns and more towns and more towns. And within the period of, I don't remember exactly, let's say a week or two, Assad had fallen and fled to Russia. And so this, of course, was a shock to Syria, to the world, and an enormous change on the ground. So, I mean, the first reaction and result was that, like, people all over Syria, Kurdish people included, were celebrating the fall of this very brutal dictator of Bashar al-Assad, whose family had been in power long before him. This is a regime that had violently repressed any kind of political opposition, had infamously dropped barrel bombs on civilian neighborhoods, used chemical weapons, extremely brutal government that very few people miss. And so there's this kind of initial period of shock and celebration very quickly, right? Understanding that the country still faces danger, that the group that overthrew the regime is maybe not the most progressive or democratic force itself either. In fact, far from it. But a few different things happened. First of all, even before the fall of Assad, while this offensive was taking place, Turkey immediately took advantage of the chaos and the sort of power vacuums that were emerging. Turkey and its proxy militias, which fall under the banner of the SNA, the Syrian National Army. Don't worry too much about the acronyms if you're new to the topic. But yes, it's confusing. What calls itself the Syrian National Army is actually just an umbrella of jihadist militias, which are basically direct proxy force of Turkey at this point. These groups moved to start attacking Kurdish communities rapidly, especially in a place called Sheba, where I actually spend a fair amount of time which is north of Aleppo. This is a place where Kurdish people who were previously displaced from yet another invasion from Turkey in the region of Afrin had been living. And Turkish-backed SNA ethnically cleansed Sheba Canton of 150,000 people, something like this. Almost all of them Kurds who had to flee their homes. Many civilians were killed in the process. The city of Manbij also fell during this time. And at this point, what happened was the areas under the control of the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces kind of shrunk a bit eastward to the Euphrates River, which is where the front line kind of is right now. And there's ongoing clashes between the SDF and Turkish-backed militias. So now we're in this new Syria where HDS and its leader, Jolani, who now goes by the name of Shara, is the new de facto president of the country. But of course, this is somebody who has a very sort of savvy political strategy, rebranded himself and his organization to try to be more sort of appealing or almost liberal appearing to the West. I think it's a pretty thin veil, but if you ask me, but as a part of his sort of cynical politics, has made efforts to build sort of coalitions. And the raw truth of the matter is that HDS had the military ability to topple the regime, but they're still not an enormous organization on their own. They have limited reach of their own sort of party and militias and membership and cadre. They have limited base of supporters, especially when you get outside of those areas of Western Syria. And so for their own reasons, they had to realize that they don't have the power to impose their direct control on all parts of Syria. And now, because of the course of the war, the Kurdish-led movement has their own self-defense forces. They're the largest military force in Syria now as a united umbrella, over 100,000 people in arms. And they are in no hurry to give up their power or their autonomy. But an agreement has been tentatively reached. So people may have seen in the news that a tentative agreement was signed by the general of the SDF as well as Jolani, the head of HTS, that the new Syria would include some guarantees for Kurdish rights. That would be a big deal. That would be a new thing for Syria ever. And that the Syrian Democratic Forces, these kind of regional autonomous self-defense forces, would be integrated in some way into the new Syrian state, based on a set of agreements that will have to be worked out over the coming months or maybe as long as a year. So that was really big news, really big news. That means that both parties to the agreement see reason to try to put an end to the fighting, see an interest for themselves in trying to work out the details of some kind of power sharing. Now, after that, just the other day, with the ink barely dried, Jolani signed another agreement, which was the sort of draft interim constitution of Syria, which was written by a committee appointed by him directly, I think. It did not include any delegates, representatives from Northeast Syria. And this constitution told a very different story. So this draft constitution outlines first of all, continues to keep the name the Syrian Arab Republic, which is a major point of contention, right? Not all Syrians are Arabs. That's an explicitly nationalist platform. The official, not only would the official religion of the country be Islam, or the president be required to be a Muslim, but that Islam itself would be explicitly seen as the basis for the law itself. Also granted kind of sweeping central powers to the president, who would directly appoint the legislative branch and have full veto power for this period of up to 5 years, and even stipulates basically the banning of political parties until otherwise granted. So this is kind of the opposite of the message of reconciliation, integration, some form of decentralization, which of course is what the movement has been pushing for. It's important to say, maybe lastly here before we move on, that the Kurdish movement is not pushing for a new nation state. They're not pushing for their region to draw new borders and become independent. They have always been trying not only to integrate into Syria as a country, but to push for the democratization of Syria itself, right? They say, we are not asking for anything we have not already achieved. We believe that we have a right to maintain our self-governance and our self-defense, and that all people, all communities in this country and in every country should have that right. So in their words, we advocate that all of Syria recognize the rights of minorities and of local communities for self-governance. And this is just going to be an ongoing tension. And we'll have to see how it all shakes out. Nobody can really predict what's going to happen at this stage, but the movement has not lost its convictions at all. You did ask about Öcalan and the PKK, and I'll just say really quick that it's true. The imprisoned leader Öcalan called for the PKK, which resides mainly with a group of guerrillas that are based in the mountains of northern Iraq. He did call on the PKK to disarm and disband, but it's important to understand the context and the full meaning of this. Öcalan also said that in order to do that, the party is going to have to call a Congress. For that to be possible, there's going to have to be an opening for democratic politics to take place. There's going to have to be a cessation of hostilities. And so the party leadership, for its part, has recognized this, has supported Öcalan's call and said, hey, we are committed to peace. We are committed to pursuing our goals in Turkey through democratic politics rather than through armed struggle. But in order to even be able to hold a Congress, discuss these matters, let alone have a democratic politics to carry out in Turkey, the Turkish state has to make that possible. It has to stop bombing the Kurdish forces. It has to, release political prisoners and allow them to participate openly and officially in the democratic process in Turkey. And lastly, the party's calling for Öcalan himself to be released so that he can actually participate in stewarding this process and mediating these negotiations in person.
So one last question for me, and then we'll go to the questions people have put in the chat. And that's the question of Trump. In 2019, he wanted to pull all the U.S. troops out and gave the green light to Turkey to attack Rojava.
Yeah.
But maybe I've been looking. I haven't really heard any signals from the Trump administration this time.
Yeah. So that's a hard one to answer because, it's maybe it's not so hard to answer, right? Trump is unpredictable and he's impulsive. So when it comes to trying to assess what's going to happen, I'm very hesitant, because it's just sort of always depends, right? Maybe he sees a photograph and changes his mind, or somebody calls him on the phone and tells him something that convinces him. But I think, we need not reduce our attempt to analyze the situation to that, right? So first of all, we have a reference in 2019 in Trump's first term. First of all, Trump has a particular affinity and friendship for President Erdogan of Turkey, sort of authoritarian leader of the Turkish state. And in 2019, he kind of had a phone call with him and gave him the green light to invade northern Syria, occupy Kurdish cities, and displace hundreds of thousands of people. I have friends now from places like Syria, who haven't been able to visit their homes since 2019. Were violently displaced from their villages. This happened to thousands of people. Trump faced some backlash because, frankly, there's kind of contradictions within the U.S. security state on this question, and much of the military actually has a high esteem and respect for the kind of Kurdish forces there, because they have coordinated during operations against ISIS. So basically, Trump wanted to withdraw completely from Syria in 2019. He removed forces from the border enough to allow a Turkish invasion, but he did not remove U.S. forces altogether, which, by the way, is something like 1,000 special forces operators. It's not an enormous force, but it's a real presence. There's a couple of bases, and there's direct collaboration to this day, specifically on operations against ISIS cells, and only in those operations. Fast forwarding to today, kind of a mixed bag. During the interregnum, Trump was signaling full withdrawal from Syria, had very early conversations with Erdogan. Yet again, the writing was kind of on the wall for another major invasion. But, things have changed somewhat in the sense that this peace process has been taking place in very early stages in Turkey. And, the overthrow of Assad and the coming to power of HTS kind of like changed the balance of forces in some ways. One of the things that's changed with the overthrow of Assad, as far as the U.S. is concerned, is that the Iranian state had a strong relationship with the Syrian state under Assad. And that extended all the way to like Lebanon. Syria was a real hub for like logistics, getting to Hezbollah and things like that. So even though HTS is like still a listed terrorist organization, and the Israeli state and the U.S. security state are no friends of Al-Qaeda affiliates, nonetheless, there were some real advantages as far as kind of U.S. and Israeli kind of interests are concerned, when it came to like the weakening of Iran, for example. Now, this could also incentivize the U.S. wanting to stick around longer to make sure that Iran doesn't make another major push. Iran has its own proxy militias on the ground in Syria. But there's a lot more that's taking place too, right? It's possible that there's some rumblings that Trump may even want to kind of like cut some deals with HTS and be able to have like U.S. business deals in a more quote unquote stabilized future Syria. So the U.S. Recently really pushed the SDF, the Kurdish-led movement, to sign this initial agreement with HTS. And the threat of an imminent U.S. withdrawal, a full withdrawal, was really a motivation, because, like it or not, the U.S. presence and limited U.S. kind of tactical support of the SDF against ISIS has been really crucial to the survival of the autonomous administration and of these communities. Has really been an existential question because of the threat of Turkey. So if the U.S. is going to withdraw, there's all the more reason for the movement to cut some kind of a deal with the new Syrian state, consolidate their gains as best they can, and try to at least come to some minimum compromise where there's enough room for the movement to pursue democratic politics, what they call democratic politics, which is, for them, is not just within state structures, maybe running candidates for local and regional elections and things like that, if that's possible in a future Syria, but grassroots democratic politics. In other words, to continue to organize the communes and the villages and the neighborhoods and all of these things. So it's yet to be seen how it's all going to shake out, but I think there's a very good chance that we're going to see a U.S. withdrawal in the coming months, and that's going to be a major determining factor of whether and how these agreements between Kurdish communities and the new Syrian state become shaped. That was a very unsatisfactory answer, I'm sure, but I'm also unsatisfied. It's just,
Well,
it's
I
really,
think,
everything's in flux.
yeah, but I think you really clearly laid out, the forces involved in the possible decisions, and we'll have to see. You're right.
Yeah.
So I think people now have a really good introduction to what's going on, what's happened in Rojava, and the problems it faces now. So why don't we go to the questions that have been posted in the chat? And here we go. At war with dust. If Norway represents a model for developed nations and Bolivia a model for developing nations, do you think Rojava might be a model for populations searching for an alternative to the nation state?
I think that's a great way to put it, and I agree wholeheartedly. I think that really, in many ways, sums up in the most succinct way possible what Rojava represents. It is an alternative model to the nation state. I would just modify it to say I think it's a model for all nations, or more particularly communities. The way that the movement talks about it in its own philosophy, nations can't be reduced to states. In fact, they're even though a nation is itself some sort of social construction to a certain extent, what they're trying to get closer to is real organic communities of people who learn and practice what it really means to self-govern. And I think that community self-governance, really, this is personally, I'm speaking for myself here, but I think it's reflective of the way the movement sees it as well, is it's not just an example of an alternative, it's an imperative. We kind of have no alternative because we're living through a moment where I think we're seeing that capitalism and the power of nation states are bringing humanity itself to the brink of extinction, or at least extreme destabilization and loss of life. Looking at the ecological crisis that humanity is now facing, I think we can understand it as really a symptom of capitalism, of state power. And I don't want to give the impression that Rojava is some sort of utopia. Really, like, for anybody who's been there in person, they'll tell you, like, it's a total mess. It's a total mess, but it's real, and it's human, and it's practical, and people are working out in real time concrete ways to organize themselves outside of these paradigms of kind of domination and exploitation. And the fact that it's so messy, the fact that it's real is really what gives me hope. And I think especially if those of us anywhere, I don't know the breadth of your listeners here, but if folks think about just the microcosm of like their own neighborhood, I think these principles can start to make a lot of sense and seem a lot more possible. I'm thinking about what would it look like to bring neighbors together, to develop a sense of shared responsibility and solidarity, and to begin to not just discuss, but to address the issues that they're facing together at the local level. That's really the essence of the whole project.
Let's see what the next question is. Morgan asks, if someone wanted to create a Rojava-ish or Cooperation Jackson-ish community, either inline or in person, what characteristics should the community have? Follow-up, could this community be solely online, having such as having its own Discord or Facebook group?
That's interesting. That's a great question. For those who are unfamiliar with Cooperation Jackson, this is a group in Jackson, Mississippi, in the Black community that's been working on kind of local assemblies and worker cooperatives, and very much kind of fellow travelers of, you could say, of kind of other libertarian socialist movements like the Kurdish movement. So yeah, what would this look like in practice in our own communities, and could it be online? I think there's sort of separate questions, but related. I mean, frankly, for me, I think, we need, I'll start with the second. We need platforms and tools to communicate with one another, to coordinate with one another. And digital tools are incredibly useful for that, and vital and necessary in the current reality, and they probably always will be moving forward. And in some ways they also provide like unique opportunities to connect communities across a distance. So I don't want to reduce the importance of that, but I think it's really important that we don't see it as any kind of replacement for authentic, human to human, in person, lasting local relationships. I think that community itself has to be seen as something that has a deeper meaning, has a richer meaning, and a messier meaning than simply groups who are communicating with one another and maybe share a particular affinity. I mean, I think part of what defines community in the authentic sense is it also contains some differences and some contradictions. And I think we won't be able to get to sort of this inspiring image of community self-governance that we can take from places like Rojava, without having to deal with that more basic level question, which is, do we have communities? And I think for example, in the United States, in order to really build the power of self-governance, I think we have to start where we're at, by building community. And we have to do these things in parallel to one another. But you can't have community self-governance if you don't have a community. There's all these kind of buzzwords that we talk about: community care, community defense, right? You can't defend a community that doesn't exist. And so I think radicals who are inspired by this idea should really feel called to sort of, in my opinion, commit themselves to their particular place and build relationships and organizations between neighbors that can really last and kind of mature into forms of self-governance. But the bedrock of that is the glue that actually holds people together. And that's why we can't just copy paste things that movements like not just the Kurdish freedom movement, but say the Zapatistas in Southeast Mexico, where I've spent time as well. These are movements that are operating in communities that are already very tight-knit. They have authentic, strong, lasting social bonds. And then revolutionary movements are offering models for those communities to express and govern themselves through structures of organization. For us, we've got to do the foundational thing as well. We have to actually bring people together.
Yeah, I would just add to that, as you said, online platforms are good for communications, but they tend to create silos. So you're talking to like-minded people.
Yeah.
And you don't deal with those contradictions within communities you were talking about. And
it's true.
At a practical level, if you're talking about self-governance at the community level, you got to deal with the garbage and the recycling and the housing and the transportation. And you can't do that online. You got to do it in a geographical community.
Exactly. So, I agree 100%. Yeah, I mean, capitalism has not just stripped us of our connections to one another and to our labor. They really stripped us of our connections to the places we inhabit, right? And that's part of what's at the core of our ecological crisis, as well as our social crisis. Öcalan talks about these things, Bookchin talks about these things, and we don't need sophisticated ideologies to understand that much either. In my neighborhood, when I talk to people, I'm struck by how people really seem to have this intuitive sense that's like, yeah, you know, we used to like talk to each other, but we don't even know each other's names down the hall in our apartment building or across the street anymore. So like, yeah, again, what like we got to have a foundation to build on in the first place as organizers.
While we're waiting for the next question, another thing in this conversation we have to consider is how segregated by race and class
Yeah.
the society has become.
Yeah.
And politics. I mean, the conservative communities tend to be ex-urban and rural and small town, and the more liberal communities are urban and inner ring suburbs.
Right.
And so overcoming that contradiction, having those people talk to each other,
yes,
is a geographical problem now.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good point, and it kind of begs this larger question too, because I think frankly sometimes when people discuss this kind of the ideas of and practices of movements adjacent to democratic confederalism, social ecology, communalism, you know, municipalism, call it what you will, there's this kind of lineage that sees the local community as kind of the basic unit of organizing for you know, democratic post-capitalist society. Sometimes I think there's a simplistic approach to it, which sees it as like we're just devolving the power of the wider state down to the local level, so that like people who live close to each other make decisions, but like neighborhoods don't govern themselves. Like a community, only a community can govern itself. And our neighborhoods today, they contain, like you said, all kinds of conflicts and contradictions, and rich people and poor people. And yes, often they are segregated, but often sometimes conflicts are living on top of one another. And so I think democratic confederalism has a lot to offer to us in seeing this kind of holistically. That in other words, not only do we have to kind of bring a practice of democracy down to the hyper local level, so that like local residents can come together and discuss and decide on resolving issues, but we also have to empower all the different groups within society in order to democratize the society as a whole, or even like the neighborhood as a whole. And that sometimes comes with conflict, that sometimes comes with contradictions, but the kind of underlying principle is self-organization in every community, and even kind of sub-communities.
When people ask where to start organizing, I always tell them your neighbors. I think that's Chris Blankenhorn, our producer.
I agree.
Yeah, you know, just at a theoretical level, there's a tradition on the left of workplace organizing in the Russian Revolution, Soviets, workers' councils.
Yeah.
But as Murray Bookchin pointed out, and other people on the left like Gar Alperowitz pointed out, only about 40% of the overall population is workers, you know, actually do labor. Other people are too young, too old, or they're people who are not in the labor market, but are taking care of people in their households. So that if you're going to have a classless society, you've got to include those people too in the process. And that was the difference between anarchist communism and anarchist syndicalism,
right?
Which, you know, or unions. And I think that's something that people need to think about too.
I think that's a great point, and there is a yes and approach that's an option for us, right? Like we need not abandon, nor can we abandon organizing as workers. That's a real source of social power. It's also a real place of yeah. I don't have to tell you.
I've done that, and we got to do it. Yeah,
I know. Like, you know, my partner's in a union. Like, it's indispensable. It's indispensable, but as you referenced, right, like the left used to see this in a sort of totalizing way, in a kind of reductive way that doesn't really serve our ultimate goals. And even I would say even some of the cutting edge of workplace organizing today, people like the late great Jane McAlevey, she used to talk about things like whole worker organizing. In other words, even when you're organizing workers, you're seeing them as whole people who are members of a community, who are members of a society, who have families, who go to schools. And only through kind of taking this more holistic approach can we really build power towards any kind of alternative. And I think that because of that, the neighborhood level, local community level of organizing just feels that much more important, because it provides us a kind of container for a holistic approach.
That's something Murray Bookchin used to always say. He said,
Yeah.
workers aren't just workers. They aren't just mouths to feed. A lot of them are environmentalists. A lot of the women are feminists. They have other issues that don't directly drive from their position in the workplace. And that if you're going to organize, you've got to address those issues.
Exactly. There are incidentally unions in Rojava as well. There's a constellation called Tevdem, which is like a federation of unions. So their approach is to just organize all people everywhere, and a particular person might be a part of a women's association and a union for their workplace. And then where they live in their village, in their neighborhood, they participate in the communes, and that's the holistic approach, right?
At war with dust, is there a substantial movement for an independent Kurdish state within the region? Have many or most Kurdish people accepted federated status within Iraq and or Syria?
That's a great question. The PKK and the much broader sort of constellation of kind of Kurdish revolutionary parties throughout Kurdistan is not encompassing of all Kurdish people, right? So that's a particular kind of, for lack of a better word, let's say faction in the Kurdish community, taken in like the broadest sense. But there are others, right? So for those who are unfamiliar, northern Iraq is now a semi-autonomous kind of government within the Iraqi federal state. It has its own parliament and elected officials. It has its own regional militia called the Peshmerga, and has a lot of problems. But this was really the result of kind of culmination of a different movement with a different lineage, led by sort of like the Barzani family or clan in Kurdish communities in Iraq. And you can kind of take the simplest way to look at this in reality is that there's kind of like two big groups of like Kurdish, kind of two big Kurdish movements. Okay. One of them is, exemplified by the Kurdistan regional government in northern Iraq. And that is kind of Kurdish nationalists. And they believe that Kurds should have their own state, their own governments, their own economies, and that those states will be Kurdish states that are for Kurdish people, and that the primary, the thing that's most important is that it's Kurdish people who hold power, and that Kurdish, culture is dominant and recognized. There's the other movement, which comes out of the PKK, but is far beyond it now, which has this philosophy of democratic confederalism. And it's kind of the revolutionary wing of the Kurdish community. That is a very different movement, which rejects outright the idea of forming independent Kurdish states. That not only should there not be a Kurdish state, because what happens to the rights of people who are not Kurdish who live under a so-called Kurdish state, right? Right? It's like the rights of Palestinians living in Israel that's supposed to be a Jewish state, right? There's nowhere you can just draw a line in the sand and say everybody on the other side of this line has to be like me, and if they're not, then they don't have the same rights. In other words, for the movement, ultimately, they want to see society transcend states altogether. But for now, the way to do that they see is to, again, to kind of build the self-organization of civil society at the grassroots level and to practice democracy in that way. And so, in Rojava, we see this movement taking place in a really different way than like what's happening in northern Iraq, because they're not saying we want to be on our own and have our own thing. They're saying in this place, all diverse peoples have the ability to express and govern themselves and defend themselves. And we believe that should be true everywhere. We're also Syrians, but we're more than that. And we want to decentralize Syria. Whereas in Iraq, the movement is saying, this is our state. Leave us alone. It's for Kurdish people. It's not for Arabs. Interestingly enough, the KRG is a close collaborator with the Turkish state, who's actively, attacking the revolutionary Kurds.
Okay, that's the label that tells us our hour is up.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it went fast. But before we go, why don't you say a few words about what people can do now to support Rojava?
Absolutely. I think that the first most important thing people can do is just to learn about Rojava, to learn about the Kurdish freedom movement, to understand that it exists, to understand that its aspirations, what it is organizing, struggling, and fighting for, is not just rights for Kurdish people, but is to build a sort of new paradigm for democratic self-governance for all communities. And to see it as a movement that we all really have a stake in, frankly. But beyond informing yourselves, there are ways to get involved. I am a member of a group called the Emergency Committee for Rojava, and encourage people to reach out to us. You can check out our website at defendrojava.org. You can follow us on social media, which is everywhere as at Defend Rojava. You can also send us an email, which I'll reply to you, at info@defendrojava.org. But basically, we are sort of the, beyond a sort of scattering of small local kind of short-term groups, we're kind of the only national level organization in the United States that's focused on Rojava solidarity, and solidarity with the Kurdish freedom movement. So what we do is, things like this. We give talks, we put on events. Sometimes we do speaking tours, but we also try to provide opportunities for people to show their solidarity, including facilitating kind of grassroots advocacy, things like reaching out to members of Congress to inform them about the importance of supporting Kurdish communities or all of the diverse people of Northeast Syria. Sometimes there's very important decisions at stake, things like whether or not the United States is going to provide arms to Turkey, where of course we're forcefully opposing this, where the United States is maybe weighing whether or not to support Kurdish communities in Northeast Syria, et cetera, et cetera. So if you reach out, we're not just going to send you info. It's not just a way to hear about kind of educational resources and events, but we really try to provide opportunities for people to actually get involved actively. And especially if you're part of a social movement organization, if your union or your DSA chapter or whatever it is interested in learning more about this issue, getting more involved, reach out to us, because we're really trying to build the kind of people's diplomacy. And we are in touch with the movement over there, and have sometimes been able to even directly connect, for example, people who build worker cooperatives in the United States with people organizing worker cooperatives in Rojava. So reach out. And thanks for having me, Howie, and the rest of y'all. I really appreciate the opportunity. It's not a topic that the left is often discussing these days.
Well, that's what we're here for. Green Socialist Notes tries to educate folks and bring issues to the fore that people maybe are not aware of.
Yeah.
So thanks so much for coming on. And I hope people will follow this issue. Next week, we'll be here, same time. And we don't have a guest. I think we need to deal with question, answers, and comments about all the other things going on in this country. Political repression. Trump's going after his political and media enemies. Attacks on our social benefits. Social Security Administration. Just the computer system may crash because of this babbling idiot, Elon Musk, whose motto is, break things, I think. We got a Putin-Trump alliance forming in relation to Ukraine. They want to carve it up between them. We got attacks on public education, on the colleges, and academic freedom and free speech, which is, that's what authoritarian states do. And then we need to talk about how we can organize and resist. So there's plenty to talk about, but that's what we'll do next week. And then maybe the week after that, we'll have another guest to talk about an issue. But once again, Arthur, thanks for coming on. And I think, a lot of people learned a lot today.
Oh, I hope so. Thank you so much, and all the best. Y'all keep up the good work.
All right, everybody. Have a good week.
All right. Solidarity.